The morning sun had barely touched the mountains of Virginia when the buses rolled into the Joint Special Operations Training Center. Inside one of those buses sat a woman named Sarah Chen, her eyes fixed on the compound that would become her home for the next 12 weeks. She was 31 years old, 5 feet 6 inches tall, and weighed 135 pounds. By every standard measure, she was the smallest person on that bus. The men around her were giants. They were former Army Rangers, Marine Force recon operators, and Delta Force candidates. Their arms were thick with muscle, their necks were wide, their voices were deep and confident. Sarah had heard them talking during the long ride from the airport. They spoke about their previous deployments, their kill counts, their medals. None of them spoke to her. Sarah did not mind the silence. She had grown used to it over the years. As the only female sniper to ever qualify for the Advanced Long-Range Engagement Program, she had learned that words meant nothing. Only bullets mattered. Only hits counted. Only results spoke. The bus stopped in front of a large concrete building with no windows. A sign above the door read, "All Rep, where legends are made and broken." Sarah grabbed her duffel bag and stepped off the bus behind the others. The cold air hit her face like a slap. She breathed it in deep and felt alive. A man stood waiting for them at the entrance. He was perhaps 50 years old, with gray hair cut short and a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. His name tag read Master Chief Morrison, and his chest was covered with ribbons that told stories of wars most people had never heard of. He did not smile as the candidates gathered before him. "Welcome to hell," Master Chief Morrison said. His voice was calm, almost gentle. "Over the next 12 weeks, I will break most of you. Some of you will quit, some of you will fail, some of you will get injured and be sent home. By the end, maybe 3 or 4 of you will earn the right to call yourselves Advanced Long-Range Engagement Specialists." He began walking down the line, looking at each candidate. When he reached Sarah, he stopped. His eyes moved over her small frame, her slender arms, her delicate hands. Something flickered in his expression. It might have been doubt. It might have been curiosity. Sarah could not tell. "Chen," he said, reading her name tag. "You're the one from Fort Benning, the one who hit 17 consecutive targets at 1,800 meters. "Yes, Master Chief," Sarah replied. "That's a nice range record," Morrison said. "But this isn't a range. This is the real thing. Out here, the wind doesn't follow patterns, the targets don't stay still, and the pressure isn't about points on a scoreboard. It's about life and death." "I understand, Master Chief." Morrison leaned closer. "Do you? Because I've seen a lot of good shooters come through here. Men with bigger muscles, better eyesight, and more experience than you. And most of them broke. What makes you think you're different?" Sarah met his gaze without blinking. "I don't think anything, Master Chief. I just shoot." For a long moment, Morrison stared at her. Then he nodded once and moved on to the next candidate. Sarah released a breath she did not know she had been holding. The first week was designed to destroy them physically. They ran 20 miles a day through mountain terrain. They carried 60-pound packs up steep hills. They did push-ups until their arms gave out, then did more. They swam in freezing lakes and crawled through mud that seemed to have no bottom. By the end of the first week, 8 candidates had quit. Sarah did not quit. Her body screamed at her every night. Her muscles burned with pain she had never known. Her feet were covered with blisters that bled through her socks. But she did not quit. She had made a promise to herself years ago, and she intended to keep it. The promise had been made on a rooftop in Kabul, Afghanistan, 7 years earlier. Sarah had been a young Marine Corps scout sniper on her first deployment. Her spotter, a man named Sergeant Williams, had been killed by an enemy sniper while they were setting up their position. The bullet had come from a distance that should have been impossible, over 2,000 meters, through crosswinds, at an elevated angle. A shot that no ordinary sniper could have made. Sarah had survived that day only because she had been bending down to retrieve her rangefinder when the bullet passed through the space where her head had been a moment before. She had lain flat against the rooftop for 6 hours, not moving, barely breathing, until darkness came and she could crawl to safety. That night, she had made her promise. She would become the best. She would learn to make shots that others said were impossible. She would never again be outmatched by an enemy she could not see. The second week brought the rifles. Each candidate was issued a custom-built long-range precision rifle chambered in .338 Lapua Magnum. The weapons were beautiful, with carbon fiber stocks, titanium actions, and barrels that had been hand-lapped to perfection. Sarah held hers like it was a child, careful and gentle and full of love. Master Chief Morrison gathered them at the 1,000-meter range and pointed toward a distant hillside. Steel targets had been set up at various distances, marked by small flags that fluttered in the wind. The closest target was at 800 meters. The farthest was at 2,000. "Today we learn who can actually shoot," Morrison said, "and who has just been getting lucky." The candidates took their positions on the firing line. Sarah set up her rifle on its bipod and began her calculations. Wind speed, approximately 12 miles per hour from the left. Temperature, 43 degrees Fahrenheit. Humidity, 62%. Altitude, 3,000 feet above sea level. She fed the numbers into her ballistic computer and received her firing solution. The first target was easy. 800 meters was nothing for a rifle of this caliber. Sarah squeezed the trigger and watched the steel plate ring with impact. The candidates around her were hitting their targets too. At this distance, most trained snipers could succeed. The second target was at 1,200 meters, still within normal range for military snipers. Sarah made her adjustments and fired. Another hit. She looked down the line and saw that some candidates had missed. Their faces showed frustration. One man was arguing with his spotter about wind calculations. The third target was at 1,600 meters. This was where things became difficult. At this distance, a bullet would be in the air for almost 2 full seconds. The wind could push it several feet off course. The slightest error in calculation would result in a miss. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment and felt the wind on her face. She had learned years ago that instruments could only tell part of the story. The rest had to come from instinct, from a connection with the environment that could not be measured or explained. She opened her eyes, made a small adjustment to her scope, and fired. The bullet traveled for 1.8 seconds. It dropped nearly 40 feet from its original trajectory. It drifted 11 inches to the right due to wind. And then it struck the center of the steel plate with a sound that echoed across the valley. "Hit!" her spotter called out, surprise evident in his voice. Sarah did not smile. She simply began preparing for the next target. By the end of the day, only 6 candidates had hit all the targets up to 1,600 meters. Sarah was one of them. The men who had ignored her on the bus were now watching her with different expressions. Some showed respect, some showed resentment, some showed fear. That night, in the barracks, a large man named Kowalski approached Sarah's bunk. He was a former Navy SEAL with arms like tree trunks and a reputation for being the best shooter in his unit. He stood over her with his arms crossed. "That was some good shooting today," he said. "Thank you," Sarah replied, "but we both know you won't last." "The real tests haven't even started yet. When we get to the mountain phase, when we're shooting in the snow with frozen fingers and zero visibility, you'll break. Women always do." Sarah looked up at him calmly. "I appreciate your concern for my well-being." Kowalski laughed. "I'm not concerned about you. I'm concerned about the team you'll eventually be assigned to. When you fail in the field, good men will die because of it." He walked away before Sarah could respond. She lay back on her bunk and stared at the ceiling. His words did not hurt her. She had heard worse. She had been told she was too small, too weak, too female for every challenge she had ever faced, and she had proven them wrong every single time. The third week brought the mountain phase that Kowalski had mentioned. They were transported to a remote location in the Colorado Rockies, where the altitude exceeded 10,000 feet and the temperature dropped below zero at night. Here, they would learn to shoot in conditions that pushed human capability to its absolute limits. The first exercise was a 24-hour stalking mission. Each candidate had to approach a target area, set up a hidden position, and make a confirmed kill shot on a mannequin target, all without being detected by the instructors who patrolled the area with thermal imaging equipment. Sarah started her approach at midnight. She had covered her body with a special suit that masked her heat signature, and she moved with a patience that would have driven most people insane. 1 inch at a time. One careful movement followed by minutes of complete stillness. She crossed a mile of open terrain in 8 hours. By dawn, she had reached a small ridge that overlooked the target area. She could see the mannequin 300 meters below, positioned in a clearing between 2 buildings. She could also see 3 instructors with thermal cameras, scanning the hillsides for any sign of the candidates. Sarah did not move. She lay flat against the frozen ground, her rifle ready, her breathing slow and controlled. For 6 more hours she waited. She did not eat, she did not drink, she did not shift her position even when her muscles cramped with pain. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, a cloud passed over the sun. The light changed, creating shadows that had not been there before. In that moment, one of the instructors turned away to speak into his radio. Sarah took her shot. The mannequin's head exploded with the impact. Before the instructors could react, Sarah was already crawling backward, deeper into the rocks. They searched for her for 3 hours but never found her position. She extracted under cover of darkness and reported back to base camp as the first candidate to complete the exercise. Master Chief Morrison was waiting for her when she arrived. His stone face showed something that might have been approval. 14 hours in position, he said. No movement detected on thermal. Clean kill shot. That's the best performance we've seen on this exercise in 5 years. Thank you, Master Chief. Don't thank me yet. Tomorrow we start the extreme distance trials. That's where we separate the good from the great. He paused, looking at her with those unreadable eyes. Some of the SEALs have been talking. They say you got lucky today. They say you won't be able to perform when it really counts. Sarah felt a flash of anger, but kept it from her face. I've heard what they say, Master Chief. And what do you say? Sarah looked toward the mountains, where the snow was glowing orange in the sunset light. I say that bullets don't care about opinions. They only care about physics. And physics is something I understand very well. Morrison almost smiled. Almost. Get some rest, Chen. Tomorrow you'll need everything you've got. Sarah walked to her tent and climbed into her sleeping bag. Outside, she could hear the wind howling through the peaks. Tomorrow would bring the extreme distance trials where candidates would attempt shots that most people considered impossible. She closed her eyes and dreamed of a rooftop in Kabul, of a bullet passing through the space where her head had been, of a promise she had made to a dead man named Williams. Tomorrow, she would begin to keep that promise. The extreme distance trials began at dawn. The candidates were taken to a valley that stretched for miles between towering mountain peaks. At various points along the valley floor, steel targets had been placed at distances ranging from 1,800 meters to 2,800 meters. The farthest target was more than 1.5 miles away. Master Chief Morrison addressed the group with unusual seriousness. What you're about to attempt is beyond the standard military definition of long-range shooting. At these distances, you're not just fighting gravity and wind, you're fighting the curve of the Earth itself. A bullet fired at 2,800 meters will drop more than 200 feet from its original trajectory. It will be in the air for over 4 seconds. In that time, a gentle breeze can push it 20 feet off course. He pointed toward the distant targets, which were barely visible even with binoculars. No one in the history of this program has ever hit all 5 targets in a single session. The current record is 4 hits, set by a Delta Force operator who later became one of the most decorated snipers in American history. Today, you will try to match or beat that record. The candidates took their positions. Sarah was assigned to Station 7, between Kowalski and a quiet Army Ranger named Thompson. She began setting up her equipment with practiced efficiency, checking every component of her rifle, calibrating her scope, and running calculations on her ballistic computer. The first target was at 1,800 meters. Sarah had hit this distance before, during the qualifying trials. But the conditions here were different. The altitude was higher. The air was thinner. The wind was swirling through the valley in patterns that seemed to change every few seconds. She took her time. She watched the wind flags for nearly 10 minutes, looking for patterns that others might miss. She noticed that the gusts came in cycles, with brief moments of calm between them. She timed those moments with her watch. 18 seconds of strong wind, followed by 3 seconds of relative stillness. She would have to fire during those 3-second windows. When the next calm moment came, Sarah squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked against her shoulder. She watched through her scope as the bullet traveled across the valley. 1 second, 2 seconds. And then the steel plate rang with a hit. "First target down," her spotter confirmed. Sarah did not celebrate. She simply began preparing for the next target. At 2,100 meters, things became exponentially more difficult. The bullet would drop over 100 feet. The wind would push it nearly 15 feet to the side, and the target itself was barely larger than a dinner plate. Sarah made her calculations and waited for her window. When it came, she fired. The bullet flew true for the first 2 seconds, then caught an unexpected gust and drifted slightly left. It struck the edge of the target, producing a glancing hit that might not have counted in some competitions. "Hit," her spotter said. "Barely. You caught the left edge." Sarah made a mental note. The wind patterns were not as consistent as she had thought. She would need to adjust her timing for the next shots. The third target was at 2,300 meters. At this distance, Sarah could no longer see the target with her naked eye. She had to rely entirely on her scope and her spotter's observations. She took 20 minutes to study the wind, to feel its rhythms, to understand its secrets. When she fired, she held her breath. The bullet seemed to hang in the air for an eternity. 3 seconds, 3.5, 4. And then, impossibly, the distant target rang with impact. "Hit," her spotter said, and this time there was awe in his voice. "Center mass, that was incredible." Sarah allowed herself a small nod. 3 targets down, 2 to go. The fourth target was at 2,500 meters. This was the distance where most candidates failed. At nearly 1.5 miles, the variables became almost impossible to control. The wind could shift 3 times before the bullet reached its destination. The temperature differential between the firing position and the target could change the bullet's trajectory in unpredictable ways. Sarah spent 30 minutes on her calculations. She watched the wind until she felt she understood it better than she understood herself. She measured the mirage, the subtle distortion of air caused by temperature differences, and used it to predict conditions downrange. And then, when everything felt right, she fired. The bullet left her rifle at nearly 3,000 feet per second. But by the time it reached the target, it would be traveling at less than half that speed. It would drop 140 feet. It would drift nearly 20 feet in the wind. And it would need to strike a target that was only 18 inches wide. 4 seconds passed. Sarah did not blink. She did not breathe. She simply watched. And then the target exploded. "Hit!" her spotter shouted. "Dead center! That's 4 for 4!" Down the line, Sarah heard cursing. She heard equipment being thrown. She heard men who had spent their entire careers as elite snipers struggling to match what a woman half their size had just accomplished. But she blocked it all out. because there was still one target left, the fifth target, 2,800 meters, more than 1.75 miles away. A distance that Master Chief Morrison had said was beyond the standard military definition of possible. Sarah looked through her scope at the tiny steel plate in the distance. It seemed no larger than a grain of rice. The wind was howling now, gusting up to 30 miles per hour with no pattern she could discern. The mirage was severe, making the target shimmer and dance like a ghost. She could stop now. 4 hits was already a program record. No one would blame her for attempting the impossible and failing. She would still graduate at the top of her class. She would still earn her place in the elite community of long-range specialists. But Sarah did not become who she was by stopping when things got difficult. She began her calculations for the shot that no one believed could be made. Sarah Chen stared through her scope at the target that sat 2,800 meters away. The steel plate was barely visible, a tiny speck against the brown and white landscape of the Colorado Valley. The wind was screaming through the mountain passes, gusting and swirling with no pattern she could identify. Every calculation she made seemed worthless against such chaos. Her spotter, a young sergeant named Rodriguez, was watching her with nervous eyes. He had been assigned to her that morning and had witnessed her hit 4 consecutive targets at distances that most snipers could only dream about. But this shot was different. This shot was beyond anything he had ever seen attempted. "Wind reading is all over the place," Rodriguez said, his voice tight. "I'm getting anywhere from 22 to 31 miles per hour. Shifting direction every few seconds. I don't see how you can calculate for that." Sarah did not respond immediately. She was deep in concentration, her mind processing information at a speed that surprised even herself. She was not just looking at the wind flags near her position. She was watching the grass, the dust, the small debris that floated in the air between her and the target. She was building a mental map of the entire valley, understanding how the wind moved through it like water through a riverbed. "The wind isn't random," she finally said. "It's following the terrain. See how it accelerates when it passes through that gap in the ridge? And how it slows down when it hits the tree line on the eastern slope. There's a pattern. It's just more complicated than the computer can model." Rodriguez looked through his spotting scope, trying to see what she was seeing. He could make out the gap in the ridge, maybe 1,500 meters away. He could see the tree line she mentioned, but he could not understand how anyone could predict what the wind would do across nearly 2 miles of open terrain. "Even if you figure out the wind, there's still the Coriolis effect at this distance," he said. "The Earth's rotation will push the bullet almost a foot to the right, and the temperature differential between here and the target is probably 15 degrees. That'll change the bullet's drop calculation by at least 10%. Sarah smiled slightly. Rodriguez was smart. Most spotters would not have thought about the Coriolis effect or temperature differentials. He was the kind of partner she wanted for real operations. "I've accounted for the Coriolis," she said, "and I've estimated the temperature differential based on the mirage patterns. The real challenge is timing the shot. I need to fire at exactly the right moment, when the wind conditions at my position, at the midpoint, and at the target are all aligned." "How can you know when that moment is?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that Rodriguez would remember for the rest of his life. "I don't know it. I feel it. When everything is right, when all the variables line up, there's a moment of stillness. Not in the wind. In me. That's when I shoot." Down the line, other candidates were attempting the 2,800-meter shot. Sarah could hear the crack of their rifles, followed by seconds of silence, followed by nothing. No ring of steel, no confirmation of hit. Shot after shot missed the distant target, the bullets either falling short or sailing wide into the empty valley. Kowalski was 3 positions to her left. He had hit 3 of the 5 targets, which was an impressive performance by any standard. but Sarah could see the frustration on his face as he attempted the impossible shot again and again. His fourth attempt missed. His fifth missed. His sixth missed. After his seventh miss, he slammed his fist against the ground and stood up. "This is ridiculous," he said loudly, making sure everyone could hear. "No one can hit a target at this distance with these conditions. It's a waste of ammunition." Master Chief Morrison walked over to him. "Are you officially withdrawing from the extreme distance trials?" "Petty Officer Kowalski?" Kowalski hesitated. Withdrawing would mean accepting defeat, but continuing to miss would damage his reputation even more. He looked down the line at Sarah, who was still lying in her shooting position, still watching the distant target with infinite patience. "I'm saying the test is unfair," Kowalski said. "The conditions are impossible. Even the best shooter in the world couldn't make this shot." Morrison's expression did not change. "Then I suppose we'll find out who the best shooter in the world is today, won't we?" He walked away, leaving Kowalski standing in frustrated silence. The Big SEAL looked at Sarah again, and this time there was something new in his eyes. It was not just resentment anymore, it was fear. Fear that everything he believed about himself was about to be proven wrong. Sarah blocked out the noise around her. She blocked out Kowalski's anger, Rodriguez's nervousness, the sound of other rifles firing and missing. She let her awareness sink into the environment, becoming one with the wind, the temperature, the pressure of the air against her skin. Time seemed to slow down. She watched a small dust devil form near the midpoint of the valley, spin for a few seconds, and dissipate. She watched a hawk soar overhead, its wings adjusting automatically to the shifting currents. She watched the grass bend and straighten, in a rhythm that was almost like breathing. And then, she felt it. The stillness Rodriguez had asked about. It was not in the world around her. It was inside her, a perfect calm that spread from her center outward, a silence that was deeper than any absence of sound. She made her final adjustments. She added 12 clicks of elevation to her scope, compensating for the extreme drop. She added 4 clicks of windage, not for the current wind, but for the wind she predicted would affect the bullet during its 4.5-second flight. She took one slow breath, let half of it out, and held. Her finger touched the trigger. Not pressing, just touching, waiting. The wind gusted. The flags snapped. The grass bent nearly flat. And then, for one brief instant, everything aligned. The gust passed. A moment of relative calm settled over the valley like a held breath. And in that moment, Sarah's finger completed its pull. The rifle roared. The recoil pushed against her shoulder. The bullet left the barrel at 2,950 feet per second, spinning at over 200,000 rotations per minute. It climbed immediately, arcing upward against gravity, fighting to stay on course against the thin mountain air. 1 second passed. The bullet had traveled nearly half a mile. It was already slowing down, already dropping, already beginning to feel the push of the wind that swirled through the valley. 2 seconds. A mile away now. The bullet had dropped over 60 feet from its original trajectory. The wind had pushed it nearly 8 feet to the left, but Sarah had calculated for this. She had aimed high and right, trusting physics to bring the bullet where it needed to go. 3 seconds. 1.5 miles. The bullet was now traveling slower than the speed of sound. It had lost nearly half its original velocity. It was dropping faster, curving more, becoming increasingly vulnerable to every slight variation in the wind. 4 seconds, more than 1.75 miles. The bullet was fighting for its life now, struggling against gravity and air resistance and wind that seemed determined to push it off course. It had dropped over 170 feet. It had drifted nearly 18 feet from the original line of fire. 4.5 seconds. The steel plate at 2,800 meters exploded. The sound of the impact reached Sarah's position a full 8 seconds later, a clear ringing tone that echoed off the mountain walls and rolled across the valley like thunder. By the time she heard it, she had already lowered her cheek from the rifle, already closed her eyes, already accepted what she had known the moment she pulled the trigger. The shot was good. Rodriguez was staring at the distant target with his mouth open. Through his spotting scope, he could see the hole in the center of the steel plate, a perfect circle punched through metal that was supposed to stop anything. He turned to Sarah with an expression of pure disbelief. That's not possible," he said. "I've been doing this for 6 years. I've worked with the best snipers in the military. None of them could have made that shot. No one could have made that shot." Sarah opened her eyes and looked at him calmly. Someone just did. Down the line, silence had fallen. Every candidate, every instructor, every observer had stopped what they were doing to stare at the woman who had accomplished the impossible. Even Master Chief Morrison, who had spent 30 years watching the best shooters in the world, stood frozen in place. Kowalski broke the silence. He walked toward Sarah's position with heavy footsteps, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. When he reached her, he stopped and looked down at her still prone form. "That was a lucky shot," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Even he did not believe his own words. Sarah rose to her feet and faced him. She was more than a foot shorter than he was, but somehow she did not seem small. "Luck is just another word for preparation meeting opportunity. I've spent 10 years preparing for that shot. Every calculation I made, every adjustment, every breath I took was deliberate. There was no luck involved." Kowalski stared at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, something in his expression changed. The resentment faded, the anger softened. What remained was something Sarah had not expected to see. It was respect. Grudging, reluctant respect, but respect nonetheless. "I was wrong about you," he said quietly. "I thought you were just another quota promotion, someone who got advanced because of politics instead of skill. I apologize." He held out his hand. Sarah looked at it for a moment, considering. Then she took it and shook firmly. "Apology accepted," she said. "Now let's finish this program together. We've still got 6 weeks of training ahead of us." Master Chief Morrison appeared beside them. His stone face was showing something that might have been a smile, though it was hard to tell. "Congratulations, Chen. You just set a program record that will probably stand for decades. 5 out of 5 targets, including the 2,800-meter shot that no one else has ever hit." "Thank you, Master Chief." "Don't thank me yet. You've proven you can shoot in controlled conditions. But the real test comes when we deploy to the combat simulation phase. Out there, targets shoot back. Out there, mistakes get people killed. Are you ready for that?" Sarah thought about Sergeant Williams, lying dead on a rooftop in Kabul with a bullet hole in his head. She thought about the promise she had made over his body, the vow to become the best, to never be outmatched again. She was closer to keeping that promise than she had ever been. But she was not there yet. "I'm ready, Master Chief." Morrison nodded. "We'll see. The combat simulation starts in 3 days. Use the time to rest and prepare. Because what's coming next will make today look like a walk in the park." He walked away, leaving Sarah standing with Kowalski and Rodriguez. The other candidates were beginning to pack up their equipment, their faces showing various degrees of defeat and exhaustion. Sarah had beaten them all, but she knew better than to celebrate. In this world, yesterday's success meant nothing. Only tomorrow's performance mattered. The next 3 days passed quickly. Sarah spent most of her time studying maps of the combat simulation area, memorizing terrain features and potential shooting positions. She cleaned and maintained her rifle with obsessive attention to detail, checking every component for signs of wear or damage. And she ran through scenarios in her head, imagining every possible situation she might encounter. On the night before the combat simulation, Rodriguez found her sitting alone on a hillside overlooking the training compound. The stars were brilliant overhead, undimmed by light pollution. The mountains rose dark and massive against the sky. "Couldn't sleep?" Rodriguez asked, sitting down beside her. "Too much thinking," Sarah replied. "Tomorrow is the real test. Everything I've done until now has just been preparation." Rodriguez was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Can I ask you something personal?" "You can ask. I might not answer." "Why are you doing this? I mean, you could have stayed in regular units, had a normal career, retired with a pension. Why push yourself to be the best sniper in the military? What drives you?" Sarah did not answer immediately. She looked up at the stars and thought about her past. About the journey that had brought her to this mountain in Colorado. About the people she had lost along the way. 7 years ago, my spotter was killed by an enemy sniper, she finally said. The shot came from over 2,000 meters. No one in our unit could have made that shot. I survived because I happened to be bending down at the exact moment the bullet passed through the space where my head had been. Rodriguez said nothing. He waited for her to continue. I spent weeks trying to understand how the enemy had made that shot. I studied ballistics. I studied wind patterns. I studied every aspect of long-range shooting until I understood what it took to reach out and touch a target at seemingly impossible distances. And I made a promise to myself that I would never be outmatched again. That if there was someone out there who could make a 2,000-meter shot, I would learn to make a 2,500-meter shot. If they could reach 2,500, I would reach 3,000. She turned to look at Rodriguez directly. That shot today, the 2,800-meter hit, that was part of keeping my promise. But it's not enough, because somewhere in the world, there's probably someone who's already working on hitting targets at 3,000 meters, and I need to be ready for them. Rodriguez nodded slowly. So it's not about medals or promotions or proving people wrong. No, it's about survival. It's about making sure that when I'm in the field, protecting my team, no enemy can reach out and touch us from a distance we can't match. It's about being the thing that enemies fear, not the thing that enemies hunt. They sat in silence for a while, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead. Then Rodriguez stood and offered Sarah his hand. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I'm glad I got to work with you," he said. "You're going to change everything people think they know about what's possible." Sarah took his hand and let him help her up. "We'll change it together. That's why they call it a sniper team." They walked back to the barracks in companionable silence. Tomorrow would bring the combat simulation, the final test that would determine who graduated from the program and who went home in defeat. Sarah did not know what challenges awaited her, but she knew that she was ready for whatever came. She had made a promise, and she was going to keep it. The combat simulation began at 0400 hours. When the candidates were rousted from their bunks by instructors firing blank rounds into the ceiling. They had exactly 15 minutes to gear up, grab their weapons, and report to the extraction point where helicopters were waiting to transport them to the training area. Sarah moved with practiced efficiency, her years of experience allowing her to prepare faster than most of the other candidates. She was on the helicopter within 12 minutes, her rifle secured across her chest, her pack containing everything she would need for the next 72 hours. Master Chief Morrison stood at the front of the helicopter as it lifted off into the pre-dawn darkness. He had to shout over the roar of the rotors to make himself heard. "The scenario is simple. An enemy force has occupied a small town in the valley below. They have hostages. Your mission is to locate and eliminate the enemy commanders, enabling a rescue team to extract the hostages. You will be inserted in 2-person teams at various points around the target area. Each team will operate independently. Communication between teams is forbidden unless there is an emergency." He looked at the candidates with hard eyes. "The enemy knows you're coming. They have scouts, sentries and counter-sniper teams actively searching for you. If you are detected, you will be considered killed and eliminated from the exercise. If you fail to engage your assigned targets within the 72-hour window, you will be considered failed and eliminated from the exercise. If you hit a non-hostile target, such as a hostage or a civilian, you will be immediately eliminated and face potential disciplinary action. Sarah felt Rodriguez tense beside her. The stakes were high. A single mistake could end their careers before they truly began. "Your team assignments have already been made," Morrison continued. "When we land, you will receive your briefing packets with target information and insertion coordinates. After that, you're on your own. Good luck. You're going to need it." The helicopter touched down in a cleared area near the edge of the training zone. Sarah and Rodriguez grabbed their gear and jumped out, immediately moving away from the noise and light of the landing zone. They found a covered position behind a group of boulders and opened their briefing packet. The target was a man designated as Enemy Commander Alpha, believed to be operating from a fortified building near the center of the occupied town. Intelligence suggested he would be visible only briefly during his regular inspection of the perimeter defenses. Sarah's team had to position themselves to take the shot during one of these inspection windows. The complicating factor was the distance. The only viable shooting position that offered both concealment and a line of sight to the target was on a ridge more than 2 miles from the town. The shot would be at least 3,200 meters. Longer than anything Sarah had ever attempted. Longer than anything any military sniper had ever officially confirmed. Rodriguez looked at the maps with growing concern. "This has to be a mistake. 3,200 meters is beyond the effective range of our weapons. The bullet will be subsonic by the time it reaches the target. The accuracy degradation will be enormous." Sarah studied the terrain carefully. "It's not a mistake. This is the test. They want to see if anyone can push beyond the limits we demonstrated during the trials." "But you hit 2,800 meters. That's already a world record. How can they expect us to add another 400 meters? Sarah was quiet for a moment, thinking. The physics were challenging, but not impossible. At 3,200 meters, the bullet would drop more than 250 feet. It would be in the air for nearly 6 seconds. The wind would push it more than 30 feet off course. And she would have to hit a human-sized target, not a stationary steel plate. But she had been preparing for this her entire career. Every training session, every practice shot, every hour spent studying ballistics and wind patterns had been leading to this moment. She could not fail now. She would not fail now. "We can do this," she said firmly. "But we need to start moving now. It's going to take us at least 12 hours to reach the shooting position without being detected, and we need to be in place before dawn tomorrow." Rodriguez nodded, trusting her judgment. They packed up their briefing materials and began the long, careful approach to the ridge that would give Sarah the shot of her life. The journey was brutal. They moved only at night, using thermal imaging equipment to avoid enemy patrols and crawling through terrain that seemed designed to punish them. By the time they reached the base of the ridge, Sarah's hands were raw and bleeding from the sharp rocks. Her muscles ached with exhaustion, but she pushed the pain aside and kept moving. They reached their final position just before dawn. It was a small depression in the rocks that offered concealment from above and below, with a narrow gap that provided a clear line of sight to the distant town. Sarah set up her rifle and began making observations. The town was clearly visible in the morning light. She could see the fortified building where Enemy Commander Alpha was supposed to be located. She could see the streets, the defenses, the tiny figures of enemy soldiers moving about their duties. But at this distance, even with her powerful scope, it was like looking at a miniature model. Everything was so small, so far away. "I've got visual on the target building," Rodriguez reported. "No sign of the commander yet. According to intelligence, his inspection is scheduled for 0900 hours. Sarah checked her watch. They had 3 hours to prepare. 3 hours to calculate the most difficult shot she had ever attempted. 3 hours to make sure that when the moment came, she would not miss. She began her work with methodical precision. She measured the wind at her position using an electronic meter. She observed the flags and smoke in the town to estimate conditions at the target. She calculated the temperature differential, the humidity, the Coriolis effect, the spin drift, the aerodynamic jump, and a dozen other factors that would affect her bullet's flight. By 0800, she had a firing solution. It required her to aim nearly 300 feet above her target, using elevation adjustments that pushed her scope to its absolute limits. It required her to aim more than 40 feet to the right, compensating for wind that might or might not hold steady during the 6-second flight. It required her to trust her calculations completely, to believe that the bullet would go where the math said it would go. Rodriguez looked at her settings and shook his head slowly. If you're off by even 0.5%, the bullet will miss by more than 15 feet. There's no margin for error at all. Then I won't make an error, Sarah said calmly. At 0855, Rodriguez spotted movement near the target building. I've got activity. Soldiers forming up for inspection. The commander should appear any moment. Sarah settled behind her rifle and began her breathing routine. In, out, slow and steady, calming her heart rate, steadying her hands. At 0900 exactly, a figure emerged from the building. Through her scope, Sarah could see him clearly, a tall man in military uniform carrying himself with the arrogance of command. He began walking along the perimeter, inspecting the soldiers who stood at attention before him. Sarah tracked him with her crosshairs, waiting for the moment. He was moving, which made the shot even more difficult. She would need to lead him, aiming at the spot where he would be 6 seconds from now, not where he was at the moment of firing. The wind gusted. The flags in the town snapped and fluttered. Sarah felt her heart rate increase and forced it back down through sheer will. Not yet. Not yet. The commander reached a checkpoint and stopped to speak with an officer. He was stationary now, his body turned slightly toward Sarah's position. This was the moment. This was her window. She made her final adjustments. She took her breath. She found that stillness inside herself, that perfect calm that existed beyond thought and doubt and fear. Her finger touched the trigger, and then everything went wrong. A second enemy commander emerged from the building behind the first one. He was taller, broader, and wore more decorations on his uniform. Intelligence had identified only one commander in the target area. Now there were two, standing close together, creating a situation that Sarah had not prepared for. "Hold fire," Rodriguez whispered urgently. "We've got 2 targets. Which one is Alpha? If we hit the wrong one, we fail the exercise." Sarah kept her eye pressed to the scope, watching the 2 figures with desperate intensity. They were standing less than 3 feet apart, both facing in the same general direction, both matching the physical description of enemy commander Alpha. At 3,200 meters, even with her powerful optics, she could not make out the fine details that would distinguish one from the other. "The briefing packet mentioned a distinctive scar on Alpha's left cheek," she said. "Can you see it through your spotting scope?" Rodriguez adjusted his equipment, trying to squeeze more detail from the distant image. "Negative. The resolution isn't good enough at this range. They both look the same to me." The 2 commanders began walking together, moving along the perimeter in the direction Sarah had expected. But now they were side by side, making a clean shot on either one impossible without risking the wrong target. Every second that passed was a second of opportunity lost. Sarah's mind raced through the possibilities. She could wait and hope they separated. She could guess and risk everything on a 50-50 chance. She could abort the shot and accept failure. None of these options was acceptable. Then she noticed something. The second commander, the one who had emerged after the first, was favoring his left leg slightly. It was barely perceptible, a tiny hitch in his stride that would have been invisible at shorter ranges. But Sarah had spent years learning to read body language through a scope. She knew what she was seeing. "The second one has an old injury to his left leg," she said. "The first commander, the one who came out first, walks normally. Cross-reference that with our intelligence file. Does Alpha have any recorded injuries?" Rodriguez frantically flipped through the briefing packet. His hands were shaking with tension, making the pages difficult to read. "Here, Enemy Commander Alpha. No recorded physical disabilities or injuries. Clean medical history." "Then the second commander is not Alpha. The first one is our target." "Are you sure? We're betting everything on a limp that might just be from how he slept last night." Sarah kept her crosshairs centered on the first commander, tracking him as he walked. "I'm sure. Alpha has been in this position for 6 months. If he had a leg injury, it would be in the file. The second commander must be a recent addition, someone whose medical records haven't been updated in our intelligence yet." Rodriguez was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Your call. You're the shooter." The first commander paused near a guard post, turning to say something to a soldier standing at attention. His profile was visible now, silhouetted against the morning light. Sarah could see the shape of his face, the set of his shoulders, the way he held himself with confident authority. She had studied that profile for hours, memorizing every curve and angle from the photographs in her briefing packet. This was her target. She was certain of it. The wind shifted slightly. The flags in the town changed direction, fluttering from a new angle. Sarah made a minute adjustment to her aim, compensating for the change. She had perhaps 30 seconds before the commander moved again, before the window closed and the opportunity was lost. She took her breath. She found her stillness. She placed her finger on the trigger. But just as she was about to fire, a third figure appeared from behind the guard post. It was a woman in civilian clothes, carrying a tray of cups. She walked directly toward the commander, blocking Sarah's line of sight. "We've got a civilian in the way," Rodriguez hissed. "Abort! Abort!" Sarah held her position, her finger frozen on the trigger. Through her scope, she watched the civilian woman hand a cup to the commander, then turn and walk away. The entire interaction took less than 15 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. The commander raised the cup to his lips and took a sip. He was facing Sarah's direction now, his chest presented as a perfect target, but he was still standing near the second commander, only 2 feet of separation between them. Sarah waited. Her muscles were screaming from the tension of holding position for so long. Her eye was beginning to water from staring through the scope without blinking. But she waited. Patience was as much a weapon as the rifle in her hands. The commander finished his drink and handed the cup back to a passing soldier. He said something to the second commander, received a nod in response, and then turned to continue his inspection. Alone. The second commander remained at the guard post, examining some piece of equipment. The distance between the two men grew, 5 feet, 10 feet, 15 feet, far enough that a miss on the primary target would not accidentally hit the secondary. This was the moment. Sarah completed her calculations in a fraction of a second. The commander was walking slowly, perhaps 2 steps per second. In 6 seconds, he would move 12 feet. She adjusted her aim, leading the target by exactly that distance, placing her crosshairs on empty air that would be occupied by a human body when the bullet arrived. She expelled half her breath and held. Her heartbeat slowed to a crawl. Time seemed to stretch, each second expanding into minutes, each minute into hours. She was aware of everything. The weight of the rifle against her shoulder, the texture of the trigger beneath her finger, the whisper of wind through the rocks around her, the distant shape of a man who had no idea he was about to die. Her finger moved, not a pull, not a squeeze, just a thought that translated into motion, a gentle pressure that built until it crossed the threshold. The trigger broke. The rifle roared. The recoil slammed against Sarah's shoulder, but she had already absorbed it, her body flowing with the force rather than fighting against it. She kept her eye on the scope, watching the target, waiting. 1 second, The bullet was screaming through the air, already beginning its long descent toward the earth. The commander was still walking, unaware, taking his second step. 2 seconds. The bullet had crossed a mile of empty space. It was slowing now, the thin mountain air stealing its energy with every passing moment. The commander took his 4th step. 3 seconds. The bullet dropped past the halfway point of its arc, falling faster and faster under the pull of gravity. The wind caught it and pushed it to the left, but Sarah had calculated for that. The commander took his 6th step. 4 seconds. The bullet was subsonic now, no longer breaking the sound barrier, flying in relative silence toward its destination. It had dropped over 150 feet. It had drifted more than 20 feet. The commander took his 8th step. 5 seconds. The bullet was fighting against physics itself, struggling to maintain its trajectory against all the forces that sought to push it off course. The commander took his 10th step. 6 seconds. The commander's body jerked. A spray of red mist exploded from his chest. He crumpled to the ground without a sound, dead before his brain could register the impact. The soldiers around him stood frozen in shock, staring at their fallen leader without understanding what had happened. And then, nearly 10 seconds after the bullet had struck, the sound of Sarah's shot finally reached the town. By then, she had already chambered a second round, already scanned for additional threats, already begun planning her extraction. "Hit confirmed," Rodriguez breathed. "Target down. That was the most incredible thing I've ever seen. The plate burst before the bullet was fired. I mean, before anyone could hear it. They didn't even know they were under attack until he was already dead." Sarah lowered her rifle and allowed herself one moment of satisfaction. 3,200 meters, nearly 2 miles. A shot that the Navy SEALs in her program had said was impossible. A shot that pushed beyond every known limit of military marksmanship. A shot that no one believed a woman of her size could make. She had made it anyway, but there was no time for celebration. Within moments, the enemy would begin searching for the source of the shot. Counter-sniper teams would be deployed. Every available resource would be dedicated to finding and eliminating whoever had killed their commander. Sarah and Rodriguez had to move. "Pack up," she ordered. "We need to be off this ridge before they triangulate our position." They moved with the speed of professionals, disassembling equipment and erasing any sign of their presence. Within 3 minutes, they were gone, slipping into the rocky terrain like ghosts, leaving nothing behind but a single spent casing that Sarah had deliberately left as proof of her shot. The extraction took 18 hours. They moved only when safe, hid when necessary, and twice evaded enemy patrols that came close enough to touch. By the time they reached the designated pickup point, Sarah was exhausted beyond anything she had ever experienced. But she was alive. She had succeeded. She had kept her promise. Master Chief Morrison was waiting at the extraction point with a helicopter and an expression on his face that Sarah had never seen before. He watched as she climbed out of the rocks and walked toward him, her rifle slung across her back, her face streaked with dirt and sweat. 3,200 meters, he said. "We have the exact measurement from satellite imagery. You just made the longest confirmed sniper kill in the history of American military operations." Sarah stopped in front of him and stood at attention. "Thank you, Master Chief. I was just doing my job." Morrison shook his head slowly. "No, you were doing the impossible. We designed that exercise specifically to be beyond anyone's capability. We wanted to see how candidates responded to failure, how they handled situations where success was literally not achievable. No one expected anyone to actually make that shot." He paused, looking at her with something that might have been wonder. "Do you understand what you've done? You've just rewritten everything we thought we knew about long-range engagement. The doctrine, the equipment specifications, the training protocols. All of it needs to be reconsidered based on what you just demonstrated." Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions, pride in her achievement, relief that she had survived, and something else. Something that felt like completion, like the closing of a circle that had begun 7 years ago on a rooftop in Kabul. "I had a good teacher," she said quietly. "Someone who showed me what was possible, even if he didn't live to see it." Morrison understood. He had read her file. He knew about Sergeant Williams and the enemy sniper who had killed him. He knew about the promise she had made and the years she had spent preparing to keep it. "Williams would be proud," he said. "You've honored his memory better than anyone could have asked." The helicopter ride back to base was quiet. Sarah sat with her eyes closed, not sleeping but not fully awake either. She was processing everything that had happened, integrating the experience into the person she was becoming. When they landed, she knew she would be different, not just a record holder or a program graduate. Something more, something she had been working toward her entire career. The graduation ceremony was held 3 weeks later. Of the 42 candidates who had started the program, only 6 completed it successfully. Sarah finished first in overall ranking, with scores so far above the second-place finisher that the instructors had to create a new grading scale to accommodate them. Kowalski finished 4th. He stood beside Sarah during the ceremony, wearing his dress uniform with obvious pride. The hostility that had marked their early interactions was completely gone, replaced by a professional respect that had grown into genuine friendship. "I heard you're being assigned to Task Force Black," he said quietly, as the guest speaker droned on about duty and excellence. "The most elite special operations unit in the military. They only take the absolute best." Sarah nodded. "I heard you're going to DevGru. That's not exactly a step down." Kowalski smiled. "Different paths to the same destination. We'll probably end up working together eventually. When we do, I want you to know that I'll trust you to cover my back without hesitation." "Same," Sarah said. "You've earned it." The ceremony ended with a formal presentation of qualification badges. When Sarah received hers, the entire audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation. She stood at attention, accepting the honor with the same calm composure she had shown throughout the program. But inside, she was feeling something powerful and profound. Not just pride, gratitude. For everyone who had doubted her and forced her to prove them wrong. For everyone who had supported her and helped her succeed. For Sergeant Williams, who had died so that she could live and become what she was today. That night, there was a party in the candidates' barracks. Someone had smuggled in beer, and the atmosphere was loose and celebratory. Sarah sat in a corner with Rodriguez, sharing a bottle and watching their classmates celebrate. "What happens now?" Rodriguez asked. "You've already broken every record. You've already proven everything there is to prove. What's left?" Sarah thought about the question carefully. "Now I teach others. Now I pass on what I've learned so that the next generation of snipers can push even further than I did. The record I set today will be broken someday. That's how progress works. My job is to make sure it's broken by one of us, not by our enemies." Rodriguez nodded. "You've already started, you know. Half the candidates in this program change their techniques after watching you shoot. They're studying your methods, analyzing your approach. You're already influencing the next generation." Sarah smiled slightly. "Good. That's exactly what I want." The party continued late into the night, but Sarah slipped away before it ended. She walked alone to the hillside where she had sat with Rodriguez before the combat simulation, looking up at the same stars that had witnessed her doubts and hopes. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the years of training, the countless hours of practice, the pain and sacrifice and determination that had forged her into the sniper she had become. She thought about Sergeant Williams and the promise she had made over his body. She thought about the shot that had proven everyone wrong, the impossible bullet that had traveled 3,200 meters to find its target. And she thought about the future, the missions that awaited her, the lives she would protect, the enemies she would eliminate, the legacy she would leave behind. She was no longer just Sarah Chen, the woman who was too small and too female to be a real sniper. She was Sarah Chen, the greatest long-range marksman in American military history. The woman who had done what the Navy SEALs said could not be done. The shooter who had made the plate burst before anyone heard the bullet being fired. She was ready for whatever came next. 6 months later, Sarah found herself lying on a rooftop in a country whose name she was not allowed to speak. Below her, a convoy of vehicles was preparing to transport a high-value target to an undisclosed location. Intelligence suggested the target was responsible for planning attacks that had killed hundreds of civilians. Her orders were simple: eliminate the target before the convoy could move. The distance to the target zone was 2,800 meters. Difficult, but within her proven capability. The wind was moderate and predictable. The temperature was stable. All conditions pointed toward a successful engagement. But something felt wrong. Sarah had learned to trust her instincts over the years. They had saved her life more than once. Now, as she lay watching the convoy through her scope, those instincts were screaming at her to wait, to look deeper, to find the hidden threat before it found her. She scanned the surrounding buildings carefully, looking for anything out of place. Rooftops, windows, shadows, everything appeared normal. The streets were empty except for the convoy personnel. The sky was clear. There was nothing visible that could explain her unease. And then she saw it. A glint of light on a distant hillside. So brief that she almost missed it. So small that it could have been anything. A piece of broken glass, a bird's wing catching the sun, a sniper scope adjusting position. Sarah's blood went cold. She knew that glint. She had seen it before, 7 years ago, a fraction of a second before a bullet passed through the space where her head had been. Someone was out there. Someone with a rifle. Someone who was hunting her just as she was hunting the target below. She did the calculations instantly. The hillside was approximately 3,500 meters away, far beyond the range of standard military rifles, but not beyond her range, and apparently not beyond the range of whoever was watching her. For a long moment, Sarah lay perfectly still, thinking. She could take her shot at the original target and risk being killed by the counter-sniper. She could withdraw and abandon the mission, or she could do something that no sniper training had ever prepared her for. She could engage the counter-sniper first. 3,500 meters, more than 2 miles. 300 meters farther than the record she had set during training. A shot that would require her to push beyond everything she had ever achieved. Sarah made her decision. She shifted her rifle slowly, millimeter by millimeter, moving her aim from the convoy below to the hillside in the distance. Her spotter, a young operator named Jackson, who had replaced Rodriguez for this deployment, watched in confusion. "What are you doing?" he whispered. "The target is down there, not up there." "There's a counter-sniper on that hillside," Sarah replied, her voice barely audible. "If I don't take him out first, neither of us is leaving this rooftop alive." Jackson went pale. He raised his spotting scope and began searching the hillside, trying to find the threat that Sarah had already identified. After a long moment, he saw it too, a tiny shape hidden among the rocks, a rifle barrel protruding from a concealed position. "I see him," Jackson said, "but that's over 2 miles away. No one can make that shot." Sarah remembered the first time she had heard those words. Master Chief Morrison, standing at the extreme distance range, explaining that no one could hit the 2,800-meter target. She had proved him wrong that day. She would prove Jackson wrong today. "Watch the target," she ordered. "Tell me when you see impact." She began her calculations. 3,500 meters. The bullet would be in the air for nearly 8 seconds. It would drop over 300 feet. The wind would push it more than 50 feet off course. And she would have to hit a target that was no larger than a human torso, hidden among rocks that could deflect her shot. But she had spent her entire life preparing for this moment. Every hour of training, every record she had broken, every impossible shot she had made. All of it had been leading here, to this rooftop, to this target, to this test of everything she believed she could do. She found her stillness. She took her breath. She placed her finger on the trigger, and she fired. The bullet left her rifle and began its long journey through the air. Sarah did not look away. She kept her eye on the scope, watching the distant hillside, counting the seconds in her head. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. On the distant hillside, a spray of red mist exploded from behind the rocks. The counter-sniper's body slumped forward. His own shot never fired, his threat neutralized before he could harm anyone. "Hit," Jackson said, his voice shaking with disbelief. "Confirm kill at 3,500 meters. That's not humanly possible." Sarah was already shifting her aim back to the original target. The convoy was beginning to move. She had perhaps 30 seconds before the high-value target was inside an armored vehicle and beyond reach. She made her calculations. 2,800 meters, child's play compared to what she had just accomplished. She took her breath, found her stillness, and fired. The target dropped. Mission complete. The extraction helicopter arrived 45 minutes later. Sarah climbed aboard without looking back at the rooftop that had witnessed her greatest achievement. She sat in silence as the aircraft lifted into the sky, carrying her away from danger and toward home. Jackson sat across from her, still processing what he had seen. 2 kills at extreme range in the same engagement. A counter-sniper shot at 3,500 meters. A primary target at 2,800 meters. They're going to study this mission for years. They're going to teach it at every sniper school in the world. Sarah looked at him calmly. They can study it all they want. What matters is that we completed the mission, and everyone on our team is going home safe. Everything else is just numbers. But she knew it was more than numbers. She knew that somewhere in the world there was another sniper who would hear about this shot and begin training to match it. The cycle would continue. The limits would keep being pushed, and someday someone would break her record just as she had broken the records of those who came before. That was how progress worked. That was how warriors became legends. And that was how Sarah Chen, the woman who was too small and too female to be a real sniper, became the greatest long-range marksman the world had ever seen. The woman who made the impossible possible. The shooter who made the target burst before anyone heard the bullet being fired. The legend that proved the Navy SEALs wrong and changed everything they thought they knew about what a human being could achieve. She had kept her promise to Sergeant Williams. She had honored his memory with excellence. And she had paved the way for generations of snipers who would follow in her footsteps, pushing ever further into the realm of the impossible. Sarah Chen closed her eyes and let the rhythm of the helicopter carry her home. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new missions, new opportunities to prove that the boundaries people set were only limitations if you chose to accept them. She had never accepted limits. She never would. And that was why she was the best.